What can apples and onions tell us about the larger themes of A Song of Ice and Fire? George R. R. Martin has a tendency to describe food in great detail. Some of these foods are important to the plot. Eating bread and salt supposedly grants the protection of guest right. Strong Belwas eats a bowl of poisoned locusts, apparently meant for Daenerys. Tyrion finds poisonous mushrooms growing in Illyrio's manse. The mushrooms look like little weirwood trees, and Tyrion contemplates using them for either murder or suicide before slipping them into Nurse's broth. And Bran eats a paste of weirwood seeds that Bloodraven tells him will help awaken his gifts as a green seer, but it might contain bits of his friend Jojen. Other foods have thematic or symbolic importance. Sansa's love of lemon cakes reminds the reader of her innocence, a lingering love for the comforts of childhood despite her difficult circumstances. The bloody pink lamb served at the Red Wedding is an on-the-nose symbol for the young wolf being led like a lamb to the slaughter. Perhaps the most analyzed food in the series, Renly's peach has its literary counterpart in T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, a pillar of modernist poetry and a portrait of supreme insecurity. Here, the question of whether or not to eat a peach highlights the speaker's anxious indecision. To eat a fruit is to make a choice. Martin continues the anxiety of Eliot's poem in Stannis, who refuses to eat his brother's peach and is haunted afterward by the consequences of that choice. Stannis is Prufrock, forever dwelling on his decisions and questioning his place in history. Incidentally, the first Baratheon brother to offer someone a peach is actually Robert, trying to convince Ned to come south. We get another instance of a character declining a fruit when Littlefinger offers Sansa a pomegranate. If Stannis is Prufrock, Sansa is Persephone. Littlefinger is Hades. He's abducted her, taken her to his home, and he's offering her pomegranate seeds. But unlike Persephone, Sansa refuses. This might signal a happier ending for Sansa than her mythological counterpart. The pomegranate is the realm. Littlefinger cuts it in half with a knife before devouring it piece by piece until his lips are stained red. While he eats, he gloats about his schemes, his role in Joffrey's death, and his plan to divide and conquer. Sansa rejects the pomegranate because she doesn't want to get messy, but the pear she eats dribbles juice down her chin. Littlefinger squeezes his blood orange, but Sansa uses a spoon. Sansa will try to avoid getting any blood on her hands, but that's difficult when you're eating at Littlefinger's table. So, what about apples and onions? Because so many of these thematically charged fruits so far have been luxuries. Peaches and pomegranates, oranges and lemon cakes. These are hard to come by for most people in Westeros. You won't find pomegranates served with any bowl of brown in Flea Bottom, and lemon trees only grow in the south, and certainly not as far north as Davos. When Martin mentions the fruits and vegetables that the small folk are eating, they're usually apples or onions. Arya finds onions and the occasional apple in her bowls at Flea Bottom. While traveling with Yoren, she eats baked apples at the ivy-covered inn and steals apples from orchards along the roadside. In fact, apples and onions seem to be more than just food. They're repeatedly personified throughout the series. Davos is the Onion Knight. The red and green apple fossaways provide Martin with plenty of material for apple humor. Tormund calls his daughter Munda his Little Autumn Apple. When Brown Ben Plum, another fruity name, tries to convince Daenerys not to let starving refugees into the city, he says that you got to keep the bad apples from the good. But Daenerys rejects this analogy. She says, "These are not apples. These are men and women, sick and hungry and afraid." So, if Stannis and Renly are going to war over a peach, and Littlefinger is carving up the realm like a pomegranate, what kind of symbolic or thematic role could apples and onions be playing in this story? Rotten apples seem to follow Jon Snow, In fact, they keep popping up right when Jon makes pivotal decisions. Jon packs a withered brown apple in his saddlebag when he takes his midnight ride to join his brother at the end of a Game of Thrones. He's troubled by his decision to desert the Night's Watch. He eats the apple, it's juicy but soft, and it's while he's eating it that his friends find him and he decides to turn back. Jon's decision to stay with the Night's Watch has far-reaching consequences. Jon steps on a rotten apple while raiding south of the Wall with the wildlings in a storm of swords. He's torn between his love for Ygritte and his duty to the Night's Watch. He's just had a conversation with Ygritte where she's used apples as an example in her critique of private property. Martin also uses the detail of the rotten apple as a way to glue this Jon chapter to its parallel Bran chapter, because both Bran and Summer notice the apples that are scattered everywhere at Queen's Crown. Jon choosing to leave the wildlings is another incredibly consequential decision, and again, note the presence of the apple. Jon watches as apples and onions are given to the hungry wildlings at Castle Black in A Dance with Dragons. Harry Hal tells a wildling woman that she can't take both an apple and an onion, that she has to choose. She chooses an apple, so Hal gives her one. Again, this apple is withered and rotten. Jon endorses this rationing, and he fixates on this moment of decision. He uses the choice between apple and onion as a metaphor for the decision he's asking the wildlings to make, to serve the Night's Watch or to stay underground in Molestown. But it's not just the wildlings who are making a choice here. Jon is choosing to feed and to welcome the wildlings against the wishes of Bowen Marsh. It's part of a series of choices that will lead to his assassination. And Harry Hal? Jon will choose to send him ranging north of the Wall, and the Weeper will cut off his head and gouge out his eyes. Hard choices and difficult consequences. Rotten apples and bitter onions. But, like Harry Hal says, sometimes you gotta pick. Speaking of onions, when Davos arrives in White Harbor, he faces a similar culinary choice, between a man selling apples and a woman selling herring and onions. Davos buys an apple and learns from the apple seller that Wyman Manderley is raising an army. Like the apples that surround Jon's difficult decisions, this one is dry and mealy, but Davos forces himself to take another bite. The apple seller asks if he's going to finish it and says he could use the seeds, so Davos tosses back the core. To take a bite of an apple is to make a decision that cannot be undone. It's a literary trope as old as Genesis. To take the fruit is to yield to temptation, to make a choice without really knowing the consequences. If you've seen my video on A Song of Ice and Fire and Moby Dick, you'll know why I speculate that Davos will be given an opportunity to kill Stannis, just as his analog Starbuck is given the opportunity to kill Captain Ahab. I like this mealy apple as a miniature version of Davos's conflict in A Dance with Dragons. Whether or not he's faced with the decision to kill Stannis, Davos is a man with a difficult job to do. Caught in the middle of an ugly conflict and uniquely aware of how the coming war will impact the small folk. A Dance with Dragons is full of characters making tough decisions, and the book telegraphs these choices with rotten apples and onions because winter is coming, and pretty soon the kings and schemers are going to run out of peaches and pomegranates.